How to make your games hard for players to put down. Hey, I'm Jacob, and I help young game developers like myself with the lessons I have learned over the years. Now, just imagine these two games for me. The first game has a really captivating story, but players aren't really being drawn in. There's no clear goals for the player to chase, and the game quickly gets forgotten in the Steam library. The second game also has a captivating story, but the developer employs the strategies I mentioned in this video, and therefore makes players want to keep playing the game. So which game is going to be a greater financial success? Player retention is very important for all commercial games, particularly the live ops games like MMOs. If people don't feel compelled to keep playing your game, then how are you going to grow an audience or release sequels? Okay, now you understand why retention is important, but how do you keep players engaged? Well, I've researched about four strategies which may be of use to you, and they are RPG mechanics, world building or storytelling, roguelike mechanics, and audio-visual tricks. Some of them are more general techniques than game design, but I'll try and give practical tips for all of them in the context of game development. I will also leave timestamps so you can go back to whatever section you want or leave out whichever one you want. So the first and probably most important way to retain players was discovered about 15-20 years ago at this point, and it was RPG mechanics. And before this, most games were just about completing the game or getting high scores. Like if you think back to Mario or Pac-Man, those games, before the level systems all came in, it was a completely different ball game. And the reason this changed was because developers found that when there was a sense of progression added to games in the form of those levels and experience points, players played for almost 4 times more. So let's say a person played half an hour per day before these RPG mechanics were added. They would now play 2 hours. So you can see how big of a difference that makes. And basically when players have a goal to work towards, like a new weapon which requires them to have a certain level, they will play significantly more. So if you've ever wondered why at the start of the game you'll always receive a level 7 sword and you're only level 5, this is why. The game wants you to keep playing and level up to get that sword. And it's actually really easy to implement these mechanics into almost any game type and genre. It's just been done so often that you can look at almost any example and just copy them. So there's actually almost no reason not to. And if you care about retaining players, adding these mechanics will be very useful to you. Especially if you're developing multiplayer games, then you can also add competitive ranks, like gold, silver, and bronze, and that's just a further way to tempt players to rank up and get some new bonuses. Oh, just summing that up, players will play for a lot longer when you give them a goal to grind towards. So think of that level 7 sword. And when you add levels and upgrades, this gives players this objective. And then you reward players who reach that objective with chests or some kind of item that they wouldn't normally be able to have. Alright, moving on to world building. It's more of a writing technique, but I still think it's very important when you make games. And just, I guess, keeping it short, players are more engaged in games that have an interesting world and particularly unresolved stories. Players like piecing together the story and will keep playing as long as there are mysteries to be solved. What do I mean by that? Let's take my favorite game, The Witcher 2, as an example. So in one of the side quests, the protagonist basically has to go into this cave to save a mysterious voice. And over time you get clues that the voice is not as friendly as you think, and the player really wants to find out because his voice keeps talking to you the whole time, but you're getting, different opinions. And it's really hard to just stop playing in the middle of that. So the players go to the very end. And in that way, the developers were able to retain your attention for a very long time because the quest wasn't actually that short. Okay, so how can you do the same thing? If you're making a gameplay focused game, so a more like mechanical game, I highly encourage you to still add some kind of story or mystery. So maybe this could be in the form of like collectible journals or messages which point to maybe something sinister or something, so some kind of story there. And if you want a good example of a game, there's one called Super Motor Load a while back. And in that one, you basically drilled to the center of the earth, but along the way, you found out that some stuff was going wrong. There was something evil. There was, all that jazz. And the game wasn't really a story-based game. It was mostly a mechanical one. So the way they implemented it, I think, was very good. And I personally made the mistake of not adding a story for a lot of my games, and they were just boring. Like the mechanics were there, but there wasn't a reason to actually play, and the players just weren't attached to what I was making. But if your game is more story-oriented, I imagine that you've already made an interesting story, so people will be engaged in that. If you're looking to add some flavor to it, though, you might throw in a few side quests which dive into some mysterious and unexplored aspect of your world. So, for example, let's say you play through the game, you have like your phone, and then suddenly you get this SOS message from the city's water treatment facility, and you have to go there, and you find that maybe there's something evil going on, or just make it up from there. But just something like that would really, I think, make your world a lot more interesting. And another thing, and actually a very important one, is don't make the start of your game boring. And I see too many developers who basically make these really long introductions at the start, and that doesn't work. And if you've ever read any books, you'll realize that never happens. At the very start, you have to make a sort of like a bang. You have to get the player's attention immediately, because people who aren't already like playing your game are very easily bored by what you're talking about. So an example here is, of course, Undertale. So what other game will do this? There's a very short introduction at the start, yes, but then sort of immediately you get thrown into this world. You meet Flowey the flower, and all that cool stuff happens there. And that's very interesting for players. At the very start, they kind of learn a lot about how the world works, but they're also interested in these characters. And there's no long little text going through, like, telling the story of the entire world. That comes later. So just for this section, remember to make your story interesting and mysterious enough that someone would actually want to play it through to the end. And include some side quests which explore other parts of your game. And then make sure to make an interesting start that's not just filled with a load of setup for later parts of the game that no one's going to go to. Alright, moving on to a very hot topic at the moment. It's roguelike mechanics. If you don't know, a roguelike is a game that has basically shorter gameplay loops, but is very replayable. So think something like Slay the Spire or Hades. And so how exactly are these games addictive for players? And the first reason is that it's easier to get players into a session in the first place. So let's say a game like Cyberpunk. It's quite long and story driven, and it's hard to get into something like that if you only have, say, 30 minutes of a break. However, when you look at these roguelike games, it's much easier to actually start playing them. And take something like Into the Breach. The session there is, you can finish the game in about only half an hour, pretty much, so the loop is much shorter. And another reason is that no one actually plays for that half an hour. It's strange. I've yet to meet someone who says they're going to play for half an hour and doesn't end up playing for more. And assuming you followed some of the other strategies and your game is actually fun, people who sit down to play your game for that half an hour will pretty much always play more than that, because, it's the kind of just one more game thing. Okay, so how do you add replayability to your game? It's kind of complicated, but I'll go through some of the I guess, easier steps maybe. And one common element is randomness. So if you think back to like Slay the Spire, you start with like your main character, but everything after that, every drop you get is random. And that's sort of where the roguelike element comes from. So if you have things like chests in your game, you want to make those kind of varied, and you want to have a lot of items so people can actually have different experiences every time they play. And another thing is with the strategies, you want to have a lot of different strategies. Because when people play roguelikes, they like to go through this trial and error and iterations. So you have to try and encourage your players to try those new strategies and new things. And one of the reasons roguelikes are very good at doing this is because the gameplay loop is short, so you're not punished for, trying a new strategy. Which, in case of some other games, like even The Witcher, if you make mistakes at the start, it might get a bit annoying later on, because if you restart it, you'll have to pay like 10 hours. And for the case of roguelikes, this is a satisfying way to learn more about the game without actually, being punished for making mistakes. Now, it's not really easy to implement roguelike mechanics, at least compared to something like RPG mechanics, which are in pretty much everything. Now, this is really something you'd have to plan for at the start. Would maybe just keep in mind for a future project that there really is a rising popularity among these games, and I do think it's worthwhile to invest at least a little bit in making your game replayable. And just lastly, it's a bit of a general section. It's audio and visual tricks. If you've ever played something like Call of Duty or Battlefield, you'll know that every time you get a headshot, just like this click, it's like, you got someone, you killed someone. And this like snappy sounds and UI basically give off this dopamine because you did something that is good in the game. You played well. And basically for players to feel engaged, the game has to feel a certain way. So back to the shooter example, they use like hit markers. So when you hit a shot, you get a notification, there's this thing that pops up on the screen. And that makes the game a lot more engaging and addictive for players because people will start chasing that sort of feeling. It's that sort of dopamine. And this really works well for multiplayer games actually. Something like Fortnite really capitalizes on these things. When you knock someone, it's like, it's like some kind of bell goes off. And that's, I think, because people compete with each other, there's sort of an element of, you get the one up on someone and you feel good. But I think it can be applied pretty well to single player as well. So how can you implement this? You probably have to use a bit of creative thinking to identify where the satisfying element in your game is. So an example I have down here is a 2D sword fighting game. So whenever you hit a sword strike, there would be some kind of swish, and there would be a sound effect for hitting successfully, like some kind of enemy hurt sound effect coming through. And when you add that kind of thing, those kind of things in, the player will feel a lot more satisfied, and hopefully you can replicate the sort of shooter example to make players chase that feeling. Okay, that's pretty much it. I'll just recap what I taught today. You have to use level systems and experience to give the players a goal to grind towards and encourage that with exclusive items for progressing through the game. Create a story which constantly piques the player's interest. Keep your intro short and fresh and don't set up too much at the start. Maximize replayability to keep players coming back for more. And let players develop interesting strategies and iterate on them. Give your game that feel, use audio and visuals to give the players dopamine whenever they do something good. And that will keep them coming back for more. If you found value in this video, consider subscribing for more educational content on your homepage. Top links in the description are my Instagram and Israel pages, so go drop me a follow there please. And thank you so much for watching.